Hello everyone, my name is Shobhankita and I'm a researcher in technology geopolitics with the Takshashila Institution. Here on the sidelines of the Takshashila Network for Advanced Studies conference, I'm joined by Professor Douglas Fuller. He is a professor at the Copenhagen Business School and also the author of Paper Tigers and Hidden Dragons. Welcome to India, and what do you think of this conference?
Well, I'm very excited to be able to come to the conference. I wanted to come last year, unfortunately could not make it, so I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah. You're also a mentor, advisor for some of our fellows here.
Yes, on the technology track,
Yes.
I'm an advisor. I could be an advisor on the China track too,
Yes.
if they need me.
Yeah. So just for this conversation, I wanted to learn from you a few headline things, right? Firstly, people get so many things wrong about China. Just the Chinese model, the Chinese political system, but focused on technology, what do you think are the three most common but also unintuitive things that perhaps people get wrong about the China's tech ecosystem?
Well, I think originally 20 years ago, it was that China had no technology, there were no promising firms, or maybe 25 years ago, and they were sort of ignoring the firms that were coming up in China, and maybe a lot of them weren't innovating on the frontier, but were making new application innovations at the time. And today I think we've gone sort of in the opposite direction, that China is this juggernaut in terms of innovation in its economy, and there are no flaws whatsoever in its system. So we've gone from one sort of extreme to the other, whereas the actual situation, I think, is a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. So do you actually subscribe to the view that all the narrative about China's tech prowess ignores a lot of the chinks, and maybe some of this is also overstated?
Yes, I think several major issues revolve around the fact that people might not be paying attention to the institutions and politics behind China's innovation system and technology policy, and are just looking at the very impressive sort of numerical measures. If you look at the number of scientific publications, even top-tier scientific publications, China's doing extremely well, it's in the lead. If you're looking at patenting, China is patenting much more than it did in the past. If you're looking at the expenditure on R&D, it's risen tremendously and is now above 2.5%. So on all those type of measures, China is doing exceedingly well. And then you think of the various firms from China that have done well in international markets or are making waves in new areas such as AI LLMs. In many regards, there are real things behind this, but I think they haven't really contextualized them enough. With all the publications that have come out, there's unfortunately a lot of bad incentives in China that have led to a lot of fraud. So China leads in publications, but also leads in sort of academic publication fraud. On the patenting side, again, it's very impressive. But China, since 2011, at the national level, and before that, even in some localities, was really encouraging patenting, which is fine, but you can get in a situation where you're sort of patenting things that aren't worthwhile, right? If the local government or the central government is paying you more money than it takes to file the patent, then, well, you can make money just patenting. And we see this in a decline in the quality of patents coming out of China. A recent study had them among a bunch of major nations having the lowest quality patents.
Yeah.
So it's a mixed picture overall.
Yeah. And perhaps there are also incentives in the West to glorify some of this because genuinely there is a lack of understanding on the other side.
There's a lack of understanding. There's, I think, a bit of a hangover from before. The business community in the West wanted to promote, so, this sort of win-win scenario. And when that, at least for, some workers, particularly less skilled workers in advanced economies, didn't pan out, there's now sort of a different alternative that speaks to those people. That's, all about the China threat. And that's not to say that China is not very competitive. It is, but one also has to remember the sources of competitiveness aren't just that China has innovative people and innovative firms, which it does, but there's a tremendous amount of financial backing as well from the state that in recent years, I think across the rest of the world, people have begun to take more seriously that to level the playing field, other measures will probably have to be taken. And at the same time, given China-U.S. tensions and the so-called tech war, China is also doubling down on its support, which just increases the fears abroad of China, wiping out all these industries abroad through very generous or even excessive support.
Yeah. Actually, I had a co-written chapter with Pranay Kutastane, and it was titled exactly this: Juggernaut or Embers of a Dying Fire, China's technology landscape, and specifically it was focused on India. But we seem to agree that there is some lack of understanding and then a little bit of overhype here. But coming back to perhaps the policy trajectory that the current Chinese science and tech ecosystem is taking. Directionally, have you seen some of this changed? Because clearly there has been some embrace of the private sector in the recent past. So in the last 2-3 years, we see there is some decisive shift towards that. So what is your take on just the overall policy trajectory, just the doubling down on the semiconductor big fund again, and so on?
So, I think it's helpful to take a longer term view. So I think there's these long-term trends that even today continue. So China's always been somewhat techno-nationalist. Now, in the past, they were in a much weaker position, so it was mainly rhetorical. If you read old documents from the 1980s, they wanted to sort of eschew foreign goods and suppliers, but it wasn't very realistic to do so. And that's continued, and I think over time it ramped up. Many people would start the ramp up from 2006 with the then medium and long-term plan for science and technology, really emphasizing supporting strategic sectors in China and indigenous innovation. But that built on the past. And the other tenor is just this belief that the state should play a major role. And that's not unique to China. Many developing countries probably rightfully believe this, but given the historical background of the PRC regime, it's even more likely that they would go on and continue this path of having an active state role. And as for the private sector, I think even 2 decades ago, there were already concerns that you had this state that was becoming more ambitious and had more fiscal and financial resources, somewhat crowding out some of the private entrepreneurship that they'll, so-called 国进民退phenomenon, the state advances and the market or the private firms retreat. And if you look today, or at least over the course of Xi's entire tenure, there's been sort of doubling down on these various aspects, the techno-nationalism, the belief in state activism, and as a corollary to that, quite a bit of narrowing the scope of private firms. Now you mentioned, oh, well, recently they seem to be saying some nice things about the private sector again. There's always this tension that they don't want to completely crush the animal spirits of private enterprise. But I would say that even in recent times when they're discussing the new 5-year plan, they're still sort of emphasizing, yeah, we want private firms, but ones that are obedient to the directives of the state. So I would say over the course of Xi's rule, there's been a further narrowing of the space for private entrepreneurship. And I think ultimately that's not good for China.
No, thanks for that. Thanks for that. What is your assessment on where this will take China, more like a forward-looking approach, right? We ended with this may not be so good for China. But what are the structural challenges, weaknesses that are only going to emerge, or perhaps we see already some signals of that already?
I think we already see some of those signals. I think, China has not really solved the financial resource misallocation that is present in their financial system, which in part is because of government policy. The government's very happy to use this state-run banking system to pursue its own priorities, but it's not necessarily that adept at steering resources to the most efficient use. And the emergence of state venture capital, you could understand that from the point of view, there's not enough entrepreneurial finance. So when they had the first sort of state-guided funds in 2002, maybe you could make that argument. Today, just the large sums of money there, you have to be worried that they're sort of driving out private investment and are just, again, maybe not making the best choices in terms of investment. And ultimately, China is much wealthier than it used to be. Before, you could invest in almost anything and it would probably have a positive return and have positive growth implications for the Chinese economy. Today, they have to pay much more attention to positive returns and things that will encourage productivity growth as opposed to just using fiscal expansion to create more productive capacity, let's say, or more housing.
Yeah. But that's not what the government seems to be doing. I mean, at one end, they are doubling down on new quality productive forces, as they call it, which is essentially all the high tech. But they also want to stay on with the manufacturing share of the GDP. They only want to, at one end, they want to go up the value chain, but the other end, they also want to maintain their share of the global supply chains in what otherwise would be dumber tech.
Right. So both of those points are true. I think to some degree they would do the Xi administration would have done this anyway. But I do think within the context of geopolitical conflict with the U.S. and the U.S. own moves to weaponize certain supply chains, this is only added fuel to the fire from the Chinese point of view. See, we were right all along. We have to be techno-nationalists. We have to have our own supply chains and our own innovation systems. But they seem mainly to be using the same tools and just pursuing them more aggressively with more resources or making, new rules that, it's okay if you lose 50% of this venture capital fund. Which again, I think that would be fine if we were in a situation where China somehow lacked capital. But overall, I think that's a little bit of a hard argument to make. And on the manufacturing side, they still seem to be being somewhat active in managing to keep the renminbi from appreciating, which of course impacts and sustains the trade surplus because it makes imports more expensive and exports cheaper. And that's, again, I think a bit unwise if they want to woo allies. People around the world, for understandable reasons, are very upset with Donald Trump. But China isn't really offering a compelling alternative. Their alternative is please buy our goods.
Yeah.
And keep your markets open for our goods, which may be bad for your own industries because of how much we're supporting our own. So it's a bit of a problem for China, not only for its future economic growth, but also I think diplomatically. You just had the German chancellor go to Beijing. Fine, they bought some more Airbus jets, but fundamentally, I don't think from the German point of view, they got any credible commitment that China was going to change its path. I would add also that I think it's very hard for China to change the model it's on. People seem to assume that Xi is a strong leader, and in many ways he is, but I also think there are now a lot of strong vested interests in the system as it currently stands. So if you were to change it and decide to say, oh, we're not going to have the state-run banking system, sort of allocate the credit the way it has in the past, you're impacting a lot of people who've accumulated a lot of economic resources and power. And it would be somewhat difficult to try to go against that sort of nascent coalition.
Yeah, and we see a lot of that tension playing out every time they talk about changing a little bit from the investment-led export model to a consumption model, and yet that hasn't happened, and it's been ongoing for some time now.
Right. I mean, the entire Xi era, there's been pronouncements that they should not so aggressively promote industrial development or exports. And then anytime seems to be slowing investment, they pull back. I mean, I think the one exception was or partial exception was in the real estate sector. But even there, they haven't fully resolved sort of the underlying debt that's there. And in China, I think there's a lot of kicking the can down the road in terms of they haven't resolved other aspects of local debt. It's the central government hasn't taken it on. And eventually, that's something that has to be dealt with.
Yeah. What is your sense about the potential future impact of the geopolitics, US-China tech competition particularly? What's the end game? I mean, one view is that perhaps in the short term, China can and will, because of the same techno-nationalist approach that it has, double down on several technologies. And maybe this will actually lead to innovations coming out of China that may be considered breakthroughs, but more short term and quick. But maybe in the long term, this will actually hinder China's progress, because traditionally it actually benefited from FDI flows and knowledge transfers from the West. That's one view. Would you subscribe to that? Otherwise, what is your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is probably also based on sectoral characteristics and trends. Maybe in some sectors, China's already a major player and has such a large market that it may be able to drive innovations. Perhaps new energy vehicles is an area where you could see that continuing. But even there's some other headwinds. There seems to be, because there's been so much overcapacity that now the financial situation in that sector doesn't look as rosy as it once was. But in other sectors, it might be more difficult. Now, that's not all China's fault. The weaponization of the semiconductor industry, it still seems to be that, China's pursued a fair amount of localization, but if we're continuing down this path of China as sort of this own separate ecosystem, which isn't only its own choice, but the choice it was presented, whereas the other major players in that industry, the US, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, the EU, India is now coming up, will have a much more open ecosystem where they benefit from the latest tech coming out of ASML or KLA and metrology. Probably that will end up being an area where sort of the non-China market can stay ahead just because it's larger and there's all these innovative firms in that market.
Yeah, yeah. I know you've studied the Chinese ecosystem and a little bit of the Indian ecosystem as well, specifically the design ecosystems for semiconductors in both. What is your take on where India is and perhaps what India can learn from China as example?
Right. So, it was quite interesting to me. I started coming to India for research in 2007, and initially I was often came with two electrical engineering professors from MIT who could really tell me the skinny of what was going on when we visited these fabless design firms. And then I'd also done some research with them in China. And what struck us was that the overall population of designers, chip designers in India at that point was larger and was much more sophisticated than what you saw in China. But China had this huge advantage in that it had a domestic downstream market. There were all these electronics assemblers who were willing and wanted to buy local chips. The problem faced by Indian chip designers then is there was no local market. So if you want to be an entrepreneur, what are you going to do? Well, you create a design service firm, but that always seemed to have limitations in terms of how much value you could capture, because there was no sort of local market. You were still having to sell to multinationals to get access to markets beyond India. What I think is encouraging is you begin to see the growth of this demand for semiconductors domestically within India. So there's the electrification of the automobile industry, which should help. And more importantly, there's all the movement of assembly operations for electronics to India. You'll get more local suppliers. Eventually, they'll want to start localizing and using some Indian designed chips. So I think in that sense, going forward, there can be a little bit of the same trajectory as you have this downstream market pulling this entrepreneurship. Because right now, mainly you have those people sitting in these either design service firms or the design centers of multinationals. But maybe soon they could start coming out and successfully founding their own fabless design firms that sort of own their own chips.
Yeah. What about talent? Because maybe India and China have a lot of their population as diaspora in the West, and China has traditionally done much better than India in keeping those ties intact and actually benefiting from knowledge transfers as well as a whole host of things and dedicated programs for that. But I think India lags in just being able to leverage Indian talent.
Yeah, China has been very proactive in recruiting that talent. That's true. I do think, though, in this particular sector, when I went around and interviewed these design operations in India, they were full of people who had come back from the West. So I think that, as long as there are opportunities arising, that's also going to be a natural pull. Obviously, you can't, erect policies that discourage it, but I don't know if you need the full, in China, every sort of industrial processing zone after a while had the recruitment center for overseas talent, and a lot of that was just sort of wasted. Obviously, it worked in places where the returnees wanted to go, like Shanghai or maybe Hangzhou and Shenzhen. But to go deeper into the interior, I think you got few people coming back, and maybe they weren't necessarily the most qualified. So,
And I think maybe this is one thing people get wrong about China, maybe particularly in India, because there seems to be some romanticism for state capitalism and state involvement. And like you said, maybe some of that is justified in a developing country. But when the example taken is that of China, the costs that it is incurred in the process, even while directing to a few sectors, but the costs in EV, the costs in semiconductors, the wastage that this has involved of essentially public money, taxpayer money, I don't think that's sufficiently recognized and understood here in India.
Yes, I think China's model was very fit for purpose when it was much poorer, and it was going to be growth positive to invest in all these industrial sectors. And I think it's important to remember that even though they're really emphasizing even more than they used to high tech, there's still a lot of support for these non-high tech sectors, both directly and especially indirectly. Cheap land, cheap water and electricity are subsidized in those areas. And of course, the undervalued currency, that it's become a situation where they're encouraging industries that probably are, in some cases, sort of growth negative for them at this point, that they're not really pushing forward productivity growth in the way that China needs. The population is beginning to shrink. It's now not a poor country, so it has to pay a little bit more attention to efficiency and productivity growth than in the past, when productivity growth was just arrived at moving people out of the rice fields and into the factories.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, critical minerals and rare earths are quite in the news right now. And in the face of US pressure and tariff pressure and so on, China has retaliated by instituting rare earth export controls, magnets. We see quite a lot of this in the news at this point in time. What is your sense of where this tech competition might go? At one end, we have the semiconductor and AI from the West, and then China now has found rare earths as something that it can potentially weaponize. What might this face-off look like?
Yes, I think it, in the short term, is a very strong card for China to play, and so perhaps limits the ability of other countries, such as the United States, if they wish to do so, to pursue very broad and harsh sort of decoupling measures. So I think we're in a situation where you sort of have restrained de-risking. But it's not, as Pranay says, and I agree, it's not all the cards are in China's hand too. It seems they're still very interested in, not even top tier NVIDIA chips, second tier NVIDIA chips. They're interested in German industrial ball bearings. There's various pressure points even beyond semiconductor manufacturing equipment or WFE equipment that they're a little bit vulnerable to. So we're in a bit of truce, I would say. But it's not a truce where they go back to sort of the peak globalization days. I don't think, among other reasons, I just don't think there's much trust. Each side doesn't think the other side can commit, whether that's China-US or even China-EU. So we probably won't see, barring what Trump might say on social media, but real policies that are enacted, much broader measures coming out than we've seen in the past, because they're kind of locked in this mutual stranglehold now, or 3 or 4 way stranglehold. Japan also has a similar relationship. They rely on imports from China, but they also have some industrial inputs that they have a strong foothold in that they could use against China if they chose to.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for this. There's so much here to unpack, and I think we have tried to squeeze some macro insights from you in 20-25 minutes. Before I let you go, just one final question. What in China's tech ecosystem lately have you been tracking closely or interested in, or just maybe some reading recommendations for our listeners to leave with?
Oh, those are all. So recently I've been looking at the quantum space, which is sort of interesting because obviously it's not really fully commercial yet. And so this is an area where I think heavy state or public support for this emerging technology that isn't fully commercially applicable yet. It's sort of a place where there's a good fit between what China sort of does in terms of its policy traditions and the space. So that's an area I'm paying attention to, particularly what's going on in that space in places like Hefei in Anhui province. Things that I've read recently that really made a strong impression on me. Well, I'm very interested the McGee book on Apple and what it says about the Apple supply chains, and what I'm hearing here. Now, there may be sort of a time lag, a book is by necessity sort of backward looking, but the account I'm hearing here sounds much more positive than the book, where the progress that India has made seems to be quite limited, according to McGee.
Thank you, Professor Fuller. Pleasure chatting.
Thank you.